My name is Louisa Scioscia Stephens, and it's December 10th, 2003. We're in Grand Central Station, and I'm interviewing my mother.
And I'm Mary Scioscia. I'm the mother of Louisa and of 3 other children. And I have 8 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren.
And I was really curious, Mom. I wanted to find out a bit more about your childhood, put the parts together that I've heard. So, actually, I wonder if you just talk about that little town in Canada, Roseneath, a little bit.
Okay, well, I was born in Toronto, which is somewhere near Roseneath. And we lived in the little village of Roseneath, which was a very tiny town. It existed for the farmers that surrounded the town. And then there was also a big area that was set aside for the people who first settled this continent, Indians. And they had a little community of their own. My father was the one doctor for miles around. He took care of those people in the Indian community and all of the farmers and all of the people in the little village. And the reason I was born in Toronto, I think Toronto isn't terribly far from Roseneath, but I think probably my dad, being the only doctor, didn't want to have to deliver me. Nobody ever explained that to me, but that's what I figured out. But it wasn't hard for him to come out to Toronto and visit Mother and me in the hospital.
Did your mother stay in Toronto just before you were born?
She probably went up 2 or 3 days before and stayed at her mother's house because her mother and brothers all lived in Toronto, and my father's sisters and brothers lived in Toronto. And then when it was time for Dad to bring me and my mother home, we came back to our little village. And I have happy memories of it because every summer, even after we left Toronto, we used to go up to visit the relatives in Canada. We ended up in Missouri in a very surprising way. When we left Canada, my father and 3 other doctors were going to form a group practice, which was a big, brand new idea. It would be 4 doctors, and each doctor would have a different specialty so that they could help each other out when their patients had something particularly unusual. And we arrived what was
United
it?
States?
Akron,
Ohio.
We arrived in Akron, Ohio, the day of the stock market crash. And everything changed. There was no longer the 4 men who were going to get together. No longer, it was not possible.
They just didn't have any funding.
There was no funding. Whatever it was that they were going to work, that the job was no longer up for grabs. And I don't really know what my parents did. I wasn't worried. The 2 things I remember about that town is that Mother took me to the ice cream store, me and the little girl next door, and in those days, little girls didn't go out without a bonnet. That would be very bad manners to go out with your head bare. And my bonnet had pink ribbon, and my neighbor's bonnet had green or some other color, and Mother had another color. And we went to the ice cream store, and each of us got an ice cream cone that matched the ribbons on our hats. That's what I remember about Ohio. And then there's one other thing I remember. My grandmother took me to church one day without the parents, and I stood on my head on the church bench, and my grandmother was so upset that she came marching back from church with me, just prancing down the street, and Mother could tell as she came towards our house that I had done something terribly wrong. And she heard about it the minute that we got home. But that's the end of my opinion of Ohio.
Akron,
Ohio. We moved to Missouri because there was a advertisement in the medical journal for a doctor who was sick there. Was expected to be better within a year, and he needed someone to carry his practice. Martin Schmidt, his name was. And 100 doctors from all over the United States applied for that job, and my father got it. And that's how come I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. And I have very happy memories of the place I grew up.
I figured out that I think you must have been 3 when you moved to Missouri.
I may have been just 3 because I was born in November, and we, as you say, the stock market crash was
In October.
And so I would have had a birthday quite soon after I moved.
So that was Jennings, Missouri, right outside of St. Louis?
Yes. A small town, a very old town. It was one of those towns where in the distant past there were a lot of mansions with big pieces of land, and then as the years passed and the people didn't live in the mansions anymore, and small houses were built on the big yards of what used to be on the grounds. So it was one of those kind of communities where it's a mixture of giant old houses and little modest new houses. And when I went to school there, I went through kindergarten through 4th grade in that town. One of our best family friends was my 3rd grade teacher, Helen Van Matry Kelly, who ended up also teaching me in 4th grade. And she was a lifelong friend. She just died recently. And
of your parents?
Of my parents, and she came to see me here in New York, and we've been friends all these years, ever since I was in 3rd grade.
Well, I remember a story you tell about being in 3rd grade, and your teacher was so proud to say she was just 22 or something.
And I raised my hand and said, "You're just a year older than my mother," because my mother, who was really more than 21, had jokingly told a friend that she was 21. Sounded pretty old to me. I think actually Mother was about 30 at the time.
And then you stayed there in Jennings for about 6 years.
Until the doctor who that my father had come to take his practice, until he was back in good enough health to take his own practice. And then it was years later that I learned that my father had never liked that man and never respected him. Thought he was in many ways a dishonorable doctor. And I know that a lot of the patients were real sad when my dad wasn't in charge anymore. That's what my mother told me.
It's not partisan, right?
So we moved. So then this Helen Kelly, who was Helen Van Matry, who was the teacher, she had just gotten a new job in University City, and my parents were trying to decide where to live, and she said, "Come to University City, Missouri. It's just outside of St. Louis. I can't think
another suburb, right?
Yeah."
And didn't you have an intervening place for Ferguson?
That was just a short time in between when we moved out of Jennings, and then the place we moved into, we didn't get to stay there long because the owner wanted to sell it, and so that was when parents were trying to decide what to do, and that's when our friend Helen Kelly said move to University City. And I always think of myself as having grown up in University City, Missouri. It's a very, very nice suburb. Washington University is in University City. And I was very happy there.
So how old were you about when you went to university?
Well, I went into 6th grade when we moved there.
Had you skipped a year already?
I might have. I can't remember. I think I had skipped a semester. I skipped several semesters at various times, and I don't remember exactly when was which. I had skipped a semester, I'm pretty sure.
So it sounds like maybe you were around 9 or 10 when you moved to...
Whatever you are, approximately what you are in 6th grade.
Well, you're a little older in 6th grade, but I think that because you'd skipped, you were maybe 9 or 10.
Don't you mean younger?
I might.
Well, I just plain can't remember. I don't know how I'd figure it out exactly.
But in any case, is where you think of it growing up.
And that's where my lifelong friend Kathy Eakes, that's where her family moved from way out west that very same time. And we've been friends ever since, as you know.
Right.
I had just visited her and her family this summer.
How did you meet her?
Well, she was a newcomer at school, and so was I. Newcomers always kind of pull together because
Right.
sometimes the old-timers aren't necessarily friendly.
Or they're
So,
don't notice.
so two newcomers kind of, are happy to see each other.
And she had an older brother, right?
A younger brother.
Oh, she had a younger brother.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I went through all the school there, graduated from high school, and went to college for a year before my parents moved to Oregon, where my father was then going to be at a different hospital.
So I remember you saying that you got into one college that your parents didn't want you to go to. Didn't you get into Syracuse or someplace like that, full scholarship, and they were afraid that it was too close to the East Coast and possibly dangerous?
Oh, we had applied. That was because I wanted to be an actress. My father wanted me to be a doctor, but I didn't want to be a doctor. I wanted to be an actress. So I wanted to go to the school that taught drama, and there was one that was highly regarded on the East Coast. And before school started that fall for college, see, this was during the war. Mm-hmm. There was a bunch of people from Germany came over in a submarine and came up on the shore not far from the college I wanted to go to, and they had bombs and stuff, and they were caught and arrested.
So nothing. They weren't able to cause any damage.
They didn't cause any damage, but my parents, when they heard that being near the school that I had wanted to go to, said no. You can't go there. So I went to the university in St. Louis, Washington University, for a year. And then
Which
we
was close to where they live.
And yes, it was very close.
And in fact, you lived at home, right?
I lived at home and went on the bus to my school every day. Because I didn't drive. My mother didn't drive either. And we had one car. It wasn't like the days now where people have more than one car. But anyway, nobody else but Daddy drove. So then we moved to Oregon. So you think I've said enough about St. Louis?
Oh, you can come back and forth.
Okay, so we moved to Oregon, which I think is the most wonderful place in the whole world. And my name, my parents didn't know. They didn't know whether to send me back to Washington U. In fact, that was their first suggestion, that I stay at Washington U and live in the dorm. And somebody told us about Reed College, and I was so lucky to go to Reed College. It's the best school in the whole wide world.
In the best city in the whole wide world.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good time of your life.
And when I was a student there, Eleanor Roosevelt's granddaughter also was a student at Reed College, and she used to come to Reed College quite frequently. And we just had a little auditorium where the speaker would speak, and she came and spoke to all of us. Of course, we all jammed into the auditorium to hear our ex-presidents. Let me see. Because he wasn't a president then, was he? I'm kind of mixed up on when. He wouldn't have been still a president.
He died.
Okay. Well, so she was a widow.
Right. And
she came to see her grandchild, and we talked to her, and she was just a very nice, friendly person. And I just can't say it good enough about Reed. One of the most marvelous things is we all read Greek plays out loud to each other in a real small class that sat in a little circle of about 8 people. And then I got a job at the bookstore in town. I can't think of the name of it right now.
J.K. Gill's?
J.K. Gill's bookstore. And I worked there every Saturday, and in the summer I worked there all summer, selling books. And then when I turned 18, my mother...
And this was after you'd already gone to college?
Yeah, because I started college, I think, when I was 16. I kind of mixed up. I think I was 16 when I started college. My mother, when I was going to turn 18, she said, well, there's a big church near the bookstore where you work, and they invite the soldiers to come to play ping pong or dance, and they would very much like young women to come to dance or to play poker. I mean, not poker, ping pong. And I was so bashful that she had to do a little pushing, but I did go when I turned 18. You had to be 18. And I turned 18 on the 4th of November, and somewhere in the middle of November, I met Frank Scioscia at the
USO.
At the USO. And another patriotic thing people were doing was inviting soldiers to have Christmas dinner. And Mother said, now if you meet someone there, you could invite him for Christmas dinner. So I invited Frank Scioscia, and they liked him, and he liked us apparently, since he ended up being my husband. And
I remember that good story about your father taking my father down to the basement to look at the furnace.
And my soon someday to be husband was very polite and acted as if that was real interesting. I don't know why anybody would be interested in the furnace.
but then I remember you saying that your mother said, "Oh, well, your father must really like that young man. No, he's not shown anyone the furnace before." So do you remember first seeing Dad?
First seeing Dad?
Yeah,
of course.
You remember for the first moment you saw him?
Yep.
Let's hear.
Well, as I said, I was very shy, so I was in a room where we were making
wreaths.
Yeah, I think we were making Christmas wreaths, and I wasn't making any effort to be friendly to anyone. And he came over and sat beside me and started helping to make the wreath.
Oh, that's very nice. And you right away started talking to each other about your families?
And of course, we both loved books. And he didn't have much money, so we started going out with each other. And he didn't have money. Sometimes we'd go to movies, but otherwise we'd go to the big library. There's a marvelous library in the middle of Portland. And you can go into a room and play music, and then we would do that. That was free.
Oh, you could just take a record and play.
Yeah. So we'd go into the library and play records, and we'd have a very modest meal, down in the cheapest part of town. And the family invited him out too. Everybody in my family liked Frank. And then he was only there, I think, about 2 months, maybe not even that long. And then he was shipped off somewhere else.
Well, before he was shipped off, that must have been when that episode happened where he told you about his family. And you were so surprised that there were 6.
Oh, he said 6 girls and 6 boys. And I said, 6 children? I never heard of such a huge family. And he said, not 6, 12, 6 girls and 6 boys. And of course, I later became good friends with all of those 12, 11 others and their families. And apparently he didn't hold it against me that I said he never heard of such a thing. So he went shipped off, and of course then we wrote a lot of letters, and I met a lot of other soldiers, and I went out with some other soldiers there too. And then...
Well, did he have any competition?
Did Frank have?
Yeah.
No, he was always my favorite.
Oh.
And then at one point I decided I wanted to go back to Missouri back to Washington U. I don't know what got into me. Well, maybe because it was closer to where Frank was stationed. And Frank came to see me that Christmas. And I think that's when we got engaged.
45, I think.
Oh, it would?
I think so. Was it a long engagement?
Well, we got married in the spring, didn't we?
June 29th, 1946.
Well, so that's half a year.
So it was just... And
we didn't get married till he was out of the Army. Mm-hmm. He was in the Army when he came to see me at Washington U. But then the end of that semester, I came back to Reed College, which is, as I say, my very favorite school I've ever been in. So he came out... He came out in the summer and we got married, and then he and I both went to Reed College together. And then I very quickly was pregnant with my little girl, and so I only went the first semester with Frank, and I dropped out because Louisa was born that spring. And Frank continued Reed College, but he never did graduate because he was offered a job that he hadn't sought or anything. And it would have been kind of foolish to turn it down.
And that was at J.K. Gill's, right?
Yeah, it was J.K. Gill's. He traveled all over the countryside selling their books.
And it was a new job they were just developing.
They were, and they just thought he was so wonderful. Because maybe I didn't say this, but he also started working at J.K. Gill's on Saturdays, and during the summer, all summer.
And this job involved driving, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So he had to learn to drive because he had to learn in about 3 days. I think it was my sister who taught him. Because I didn't drive, but my sister did. My younger sister. Yeah, so imagine that, learning to drive in 2 or 3 days and then going off to other towns. He never complained about it.
And I remember him coming back and the front grille of the car was covered with insects. Because you just drive through.
I don't remember that. Then he wanted me to learn to drive, and I said, no, absolutely not. My mother never learned. I'm not going to learn to drive. And then he kept pushing, and he just kept insisting that I learn to drive. And I was very grumpy about it. And by this time...
And you cried sometimes.
Did I?
I remember this, as he was trying to make you learn to parallel park.
Seems so funny now. By this time, we had 2 or 3 kids when he was teaching me to drive. And I was so grumpy and so ungrateful. And he just barely had gotten me the driver's license, and he got invited to take a job in California. And if he hadn't have taught me then, he never would have had time to teach me in California, because he was always on in a car and dashing off somewhere. Because now he had a bigger circle of more places to go to sell books.
Right.
And so...
And I heard that, I don't even know if this is true, but I heard that the way he got that job was because on a radio show, someone had called in to ask about books, and then somebody else called in, a listener responded saying that the one person who knew more about books than anybody was Mary Scioscia, working at J.K. Gill's wholesale division. And then the person who worked at Harper & Row, or I guess that was just Harper and Brothers at that time, heard that and got in touch with Dad, and that's how Dad got the job.
I'll be darned, I didn't remember that.
I might have made it up, but I don't think so.
No, you wouldn't have made it up, because Frank was really very smart, and of course he had never expected to go to college. He worked in a factory before the war, and if it hadn't been that he was in the Army and got the GI Bill, that he never would have gone to college. How could they send 12 kids to college? Or how could they send 1 out of 12 kids? And so he and 2 of his brothers who were in the Army also went to college, and they were all so smart. There's so many smart people who don't get what they ought to get.
So that means 9 of those kids didn't go to college then?
Well, then I think some others did, because the family just got wealthier. Their older kids started helping out Grandma Scioscia. No, I think they pretty much all went to college, but that certainly wasn't expected before. I mean, during the Depression and before the war, they just took it for granted that that was just a dream that they couldn't have anything to do with.
Well, I remember Dad saying that he went to technical school because only eggheads went to academic school to go on to college.
Oh.
And he didn't care for technical school that much.
He didn't bother going.
He didn't bother going.
He didn't bother telling his family he didn't go. He left in the morning and went off in the woods with his friends.
But then
yeah,
because
they were bored in school.
But then one time in his wandering, he ran into a radio announcer who interviewed someone for a contest, and he answered the questions correctly, got the contest right, and won the cake.
Oh, I don't remember that story.
And then he was faced with the difficulty of trying to decide whether he should tell the family so they could listen to the broadcast that evening and hear him, or thereby admitting he hadn't gone to school.
It must have been a puzzle how he got the cake, too.
No, the cake was long gone.
Oh, I see. He and the boys he was, because they'd go off in the woods, a whole bunch of boys who were also in that school, technical school.
So there you were in Portland, and you were married, and you had a couple of kids, and then you moved to California.
All of my kids were born when we lived in California, and when we lived in Oregon. And of course, we went back when you were just a little brand new baby for me to meet all of his family back in. We went on the train.
And just you and me went on the train, right? And Dad took the bus?
He may have, because money was so tight.
So what was that like meeting?
Well, it was very exciting, and I just loved Frank's mother. And of course, I never got to meet his father because he had died quite a long time before. And I met all of his 11 brothers and sisters, and they all thought that our little baby was just fabulous. That was you. And we went back. We made several trips back east from the west coast to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Of course, I'd never been in any of that area, and Frank brought me up to New York City, and that was so thrilling and exciting. I'd always wanted to see New York City. That was one of my dreams, to someday see New York City.
And didn't realize you'd be living nearby.
No, well, neither of us realized that.
So when you moved to Southern California, I guess that was probably about 1955, I think, or something like that.
I can't remember for sure.
Maybe 54. And we lived in San Gabriel in the best house we've ever lived in.
Uh-huh. And by this time we had 4 kids.
Right.
And we lived near the ocean. And we moved there because we knew a family in Manhattan Beach. I can't remember how we knew them.
They were friends of Mac and Phyllis McMahon.
Oh, they came up to Oregon to.
They were bookmen. They were book people.
Uh-huh.
And so we visited them, and there was so much smog in San Gabriel.
Yes, which I couldn't stand. And we moved down to the beach near them, and it was just marvelous. And you could walk down to the water, and one of my kids, Johnny, didn't bother going to school.
Just like his dad.
And I said to him one day, "Johnny, you're never late for school, are you?" Because I left for work, but by this time I was teaching. Oh, no, he never was late for school. Well, so I later found out he didn't go to school. No wonder he wasn't late. So I had to, almost finished my degree when I was at Reed College. So I finished it up in California. And I can't remember, it was a state school. But we couldn't afford anything fancy. And I remember driving there and finishing the degree. So that I think I was about 30 when I got my bachelor's degree. And that meant that I was able to teach. And I started teaching in the slum area in California.
Watts.
Watts. And I was teaching 7th graders, and my idea of 7th graders, well, the first idea I had was that they were always polite to their teacher, and the other idea was that they all read grown-up books by the time they were in 7th grade. And I walked into this classroom of 48 kids, and none of them, when the bell rang and I went to the front of the room, none of them sat down and looked up at me. They just ran around. Some were playing cards, and some were walking in and out of the door, and I'd never seen anything like it. And I thought, I wonder if I could manage to get 3 of these kids to sit down and I could read to them. So I said that, and when I said I would read them a story, all 48 kids gathered around me, and I read to them, and they wanted me to read to them every day. And the big incredible news was that not one of those kids knew how to read. 7th grade kids. I couldn't believe it. So because I'd been thinking, well, I can't even be a teacher. I don't know what to do with these kids. When I found out what to do by reading to them, I had a bargain. If they came in quietly, looked on the blackboard to see what I'd written for them to do, and sat down and wrote what they were supposed to do and started doing what they were supposed to do, the second half of the class I'd read to them. And that's what I did every class. And some of those kids learned to read that year.
I remember that was I remember that you were very successful in that, and I was so worried about you because I knew you weren't that much of a disciplinarian.
No. I was just used to people having good manners. And also, naturally, I thought everybody knew how to read. But boy, I learned a lot about the world there. And eventually, there were quite a few teachers who were concerned at that school. It was a huge school, all with poor people, and many of them immigrants who many of them, they had families who didn't know the language and so on. a lot of teachers. There was a math teacher, a science teacher. There were about 8 of us who got really involved in teaching reading. And eventually that's what was my specialty, and that's what I did when we moved here to New York, was teach reading to people who couldn't read.
So how did all these different teachers, what did you all meet together and talk about it? Or?
Yeah, we did after school. There's a lot most of these teachers would stay after school and work with students. There were a lot of teachers who really cared about the kids.
I remember that you liked that system. You liked the people that ran that system very, very much.
Yeah. No, there was some, the man who ran it was a marvelous person, just a very good, kind, wanting to help all the disadvantaged kids. So then I was there 4 years, and
you were there during the riot time, the Watts riot?
Yes, the Watts riot.
And didn't your principal's daughter get killed in those?
Didn't he what?
Wasn't there a woman principal whose daughter got killed in those riots?
I don't remember that, but it was a very damaging and terrible experience. And even the school had a different tone in it when we went back. That 4th year was the year after the Watts riot. There was a different tone amongst some of the people that it was kind of scary. But as it happened, I only taught there 4 years because my husband got another promotion. He was promoted to a much more important job right back here in New York.
Right.
And the funny thing is, we had been back just that year before to see his family, right? The summer, and he got the promotion in the fall, I think.
And then he really actually had to leave?
He had to leave ahead of us.
Because you wanted to finish your school year.
And I wanted you kids to finish your school year. And also it was easier for him anyway, because he didn't know where to put us when he first came back. So he got involved in the new job and looked around for a house. And one day he called me and he said, "There's a house I think you'd like. Do you think I should just get it?" And I said yes, and he did, and that's where we moved into.
That was a good house, right?
Yep. And that's where we lived very happily for many, many years here in New York.
And now Charlie lives there.
Yeah, now my son Charlie and his wife and 3 and almost 4 kids.
Right. Mom, a couple of things I wanted to ask you. One was, you know that great story about your father flying? Your father had I guess he didn't have a plane, did he?
No, he rented, there was a flying club.
Uh-huh.
And he always wanted to fly. He just loved airplanes. And there was only 2 seaters in the plane. My mother refused to fly. So I got one turn with my dad, and then the next time would be my sister and my dad, and then, every other.
And how old were you?
Well, I can't remember exactly, but I would have been maybe 13, something like on that order.
Mm-hmm.
And no, I must have been less than 14, because you could 13 is less than 14, isn't it? At that time you could get a flying license at 14. So I must have started flying with Dad when I was 13, and then when I turned 14, he assumed that I would want to fly. Well, I loved going up with him, but I did not want to be in charge of the plane myself. He was so surprised. But my sister was quite eager, but she was younger, so she didn't get to right then. She did eventually learn to fly, I'm pretty sure. But going out flying with Daddy was just a super wonderful thing.
And didn't you have that great story of feeling tense because you knew he was going to try and give you lessons, and you were so relieved to come home one day, and your mother was outside waving to you frantically? Remember that? You were out flying with your father, and you were nervous because you didn't know how to tell him that you didn't want to become a pilot. And as you were coming home, your mother's outside waving, and you didn't know why she was so sort of a mixture of excited and nervous, and she was telling you that the war had just broken out, and that
which wasn't exactly good news.
But you were so relieved not to have to tell your father that.
And as it happens, they closed up the those amateur flying, I mean, I don't know if you'd call them amateur flying grounds, but those were closed up during the war. So Dad even himself couldn't fly then. And then later my sister learned to fly. She loved to fly.
And he must have also, because you told me he took me up when I was little, when I was just a baby.
Well, as soon as, I mean, I might be wrong, but I don't think he was allowed to fly during the war in those, I mean, not that he wasn't allowed to, it was that they closed the
civilian Air Force.
Yeah. So, yes, he did fly when we lived in Oregon. And Bev, of course, I'd forgotten she learned to fly, but she would have loved to, because her personality was totally different from mine.
So we only have a few minutes left. So what was your personality?
My sister?
Yours.
Oh, well, you know, I wanted to be an actress. I liked anything dramatic. And
Well, flying is dramatic.
oh yeah, it's flying. If your father's doing the flying, it's real dramatic. I loved reading. I've always, you know, read a lot of books. I liked art. My sister and I were totally different from each other. My sister, I didn't even particularly want to learn to drive, although I'm grateful that my husband insisted on making me learn to drive. But Bev was, she liked skiing and flying, and she just had a different personality from me. And she wasn't interested in drama or plays or and I don't even think she read as much as I did. We were different people.
Her age was 4 years younger than you.
Yeah, and of course I thought I picked her out at the hospital.
And how did that happen?
Well, Dad took me to see Mother at the hospital, and Mother told me to look at the babies and see which one I thought we should have.
How did she? Was it kind of chancy? Because although they could have traded babies, it'd be hard to.
It wouldn't, you know,
right?
I wouldn't really have remembered which one I pointed to when they brought her home. They could easily say, "This is the one you pointed at." I don't really think she should have told me that.
It is a lot of responsibility. Well, Mom, this is great. There's a lot of little gaps to fill in, but that's a great overview. Thanks, Mom.
Well,